When we're talking about unicellular organisms, whether it's bacteria, archaea, or other protists, we should also mention that there's a huge diversity of metabolic strategies. Autotrophs are self-feeders. They assemble their own organic molecules. In contrast, heterotrophs get their carbon by consuming organic molecules produced by other organisms. Phototrophs derive their energy from the sun. Chemotrophs oxidize inorganic or organic chemicals. Anaerobes can generate ATP without oxygen. Aerobes require oxygen for generating ATP. Now remember, early on that timeline, there was no atmospheric oxygen, and so all life on Earth was anaerobic. Many bacteria are super important when it comes to cycling nitrogen throughout soil and aquatic systems. And so nitrogen, even though it's present in the atmosphere as a gas, that's not really biologically available to plants, and plants need nitrogen in order to grow. Some plants have evolved like a really tight relationship with nitrogen fixing bacteria, and they actually have special structures in their roots to house bacteria. And those bacteria will take atmospheric nitrogen and fix it. So they make it biologically available to the plant, and they introduce it to the soil. You can see in this illustration, there's a plant on the left side that has some roots that have these nodes. And in these root nodules, there are populations of bacteria that are fixing the nitrogen from the air and making it available to the plants. Some of these plants include like beans, legumiaceae, a lot of legumes, clovers like that. So that's why if you plant clover in your lawn, it will introduce nitrogen and kind of feed your lawn. And it used to be really common to have it in lawns to do just that. You also have crop cycling, where people will grow alfalfa or beans in between other crops in order to enrich the soil. And the reason they do that is because those plants have those nitrogen fixing nodules, and they bring in atmospheric nitrogen and they put it into the soil. And so nitrogen fixing bacteria and decomposers introduce nitrogen as ammonium, and there's other bacteria, nitrifying bacteria, that will convert those nitrites into nitrates. Nitrites can be toxic, especially at high levels, and so once you have a high load of nitrites, you essentially want nitrifying bacteria to convert those nitrites to nitrates, which are then available to the plants or liberated by denitrifying bacteria back into the atmosphere. So this is kind of a cycle where prokaryotes and plants, which are eukaryotes, have a really tight relationship that brings in a lot of nutrients from the air into a biologically accessible form in the soil. So when we talk about bacteria, we a lot of times talk about them as a pathogen or as a problem, something we want to get rid of. Recently, we've had a lot of discussion about microbiomes and the benefits of certain types of bacteria. Well, a microbiome is really an ecological concept that's down on the microscopic level. So we're not talking about a specific tiny organism. When we talk about a microbiome, we're talking about a whole community of organisms that exist on different surfaces and inside your body throughout nature. We've just started to paint a picture of how microbiomes might influence bigger scales of biological diversity, but at this point we really don't totally understand how microbiomes might function to affect these bigger patterns. Because microbiomes involve the interactions of a ton of different species, it can get extremely complicated to try to predict how individual species might influence others. So when I say species, I'm talking about different species of bacteria, different species of archaea, different species of unicellular organisms, protists, fungus, all of these different organisms that might live on any number of surfaces. We've talked about bacteria, the origins of life, prokaryotes, and how those prokaryotes might have resulted in a eukaryote that has organelles. Well, now let's talk about the proliferation of eukaryotes, and we'll start with protists. So what are protists? Protists are what's known as a polyphyletic group. It's a group of organisms that's not clearly related in one way or another to each other, and they may or may not be each other's closest relatives. Some protists are more closely related to fungi, while other protists are more related to animalia, while other protists are more related to plants. So it's kind of this transitional group that isn't very clearly defined other than by the fact that we call them all protists. Many protists are unicellular, but others are multicellular. It's kind of a mixed bag of organisms. Because of that, there's a lot of different species and a lot of different taxa to talk about. We'll start by talking about some heterotrophic protists. Remember, heterotrophs get their food by ingesting other organisms. So here's a heterotrophic protist that you might well enough know. It's Plasmodium falciparum. There's actually several different species of Plasmodium that affect human beings, but they cause a disease called malaria. This is a life cycle illustration provided by the CDC that summarizes the different stages of the malaria infection. Remember, this is caused by Plasmodium, which is a protist, and it is a parasite, but it's not a virus. Remember, this is a unicellular organism. So it's first passed along by a mosquito, and then it travels to the liver, where it then reproduces and eventually leaves the liver and starts to infect human blood cells. These blood cells that are infected periodically rupture, and it's during those periodic rupturing events that you get these fevers that's attributed to malaria. A mosquito can then pick up some of these reproductive gametocytes, and then those reproduce inside of the mosquito, and eventually the mosquito can pass new parasites on to other individuals. Malaria is caused by several different species of Plasmodium. They all use mosquitoes as a vector, and so one easy way to protect yourself is using a mosquito net. But if any of you have ever traveled to the tropics and used a mosquito net, you know that it's pretty uncomfortable on a hot night. Mosquito nets trap your heat too. So while it seems like a simple solution, it's not nearly as comfortable and as easy as you would think. Malaria distributions tend to follow equatorial tropical regions of the world. You can see here that malaria is endemic to Africa, certain parts of Amazonia, to India, certain parts of Indonesia. The heaviest hit areas are here in Africa. Another condition that's very common in equatorial Africa is sickle cell anemia. So sickle cell anemia is something that's genetic, it's passed down. And the worst condition comes from those who receive two of the alleles for sickle cell anemia, that is homozygotes. This is kind of a blended phenotype expression. So if you only have one of those alleles, you'll still display symptoms of sickle cell anemia, but it's not as bad. It's kind of intermediate. If you have two alleles, if you're homozygous for that allele, then you have full-on sickle cell anemia and you tend to do very poorly. Your health is affected greatly. If you look at the allele frequency in different populations, you can see that sickle cell anemia tends to be most common as the highest allele frequencies here around the equator. Now, if you look at a map of where malaria is most common, the pattern that's most immediately obvious is that where you have high rates of malaria, which remember is caused by a parasite, you also tend to have higher rates of the sickle cell gene. You have higher allele frequencies of sickle cell anemia. Well, why might that be? So here is an example of a cross between two individuals who are heterozygotes for sickle cell anemia. The maternal side here has one allele for sickle cell anemia and one normal allele. So she's a heterozygote. And then the father has an allele for sickle cell anemia and one normal allele, so another heterozygote. If these two heterozygous individuals were to reproduce, 1 out of 4 would be unaffected, 1/2 or 2 out of 4 would be carriers and heterozygotes just like the parents, and then 1/4 would have sickle cell anemia very strongly because they would be homozygous, and they would probably not do very well. It just so happens that if you are heterozygous for sickle cell anemia and you carry one of those alleles, that is these heterozygotes here, you have a better chance of fighting malaria. When Plasmodium first infects the blood cells, those infected cells tend to collapse and they're more easily targeted, because otherwise Plasmodium has ways of infiltrating the blood system undetected by our body's immune systems. So these individuals here, these children, while in other places in the world where there's no malaria, this might be a problem. If there's an area where malaria is holoendemic or endemic, holoendemic meaning everyone gets malaria, this is actually a more advantageous genome than not having sickle cell anemia. So the benefit is actually outweighs the detriment in certain areas in the world where malaria rates are very high. So here's a illustration of the malaria endemicity. So how common is malaria? Is it part of the system? And how many people in that area have malaria? So there are areas where it's holoendemic, where almost everyone will get malaria in these regions. Where you have ubiquitous rates of malaria, you also have very high rates of the sickle cell gene. And that's because in those areas, it's more advantageous to have half of your offspring heterozygotes. Those offspring will more likely survive than offspring that either are homozygous for sickle cell anemia or those that don't have the sickle cell gene. Those also do very poorly when there's malaria in the system. So this is a very interesting example of how there are certain conditions where being a heterozygote with sickle cell anemia is actually advantageous, and that's why we continue to see the evolution towards and the maintenance of populations that have sickle cell anemia.